it's hyperbolic to say possibly more than those from any other nationality. Um, and it comes down that it comes down to belief is, he might be right. I'm going to go ahead and say he probably is right. Whether or not that matters, whether or not he was targeting certain people like Michael Bradley and Clint Dempsey, that, you know, might motivate them. It might not. I don't know. Maybe that was his purpose. Maybe it wasn't. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
But I do defer to his judgment, though.
I think that's a good point that you raise. I mean, obviously it doesn't have to be one or the other, but do you see this more as a statement being made for the player's benefit and not just Jurgen being honest? Do you think it's more of a pointed attempt to put that in their minds and shake it up rather than just saying what he believes?
Um, yeah, I think so. I think he sees someone like Josie Altidore possibly giving up on Europe after this season in Sunderland, and he says, "Look, you just got to stick it out. You got to believe in yourself. You got to push yourself and get into Champions League the best way you can." He sees Tim Howard stagnating at Everton and says, "Try and get yourself to a bigger club." He's going to see maybe if the United States comes out of this World Cup and does pretty well, maybe makes the quarters or something. Maybe some Americans garner interest for those first couple of months in that transfer window that happens after the World Cup, and he wants to instill in that belief today that you can play in Champions League. You have the quality to play in Champions League. You just need to believe. You need to be able to kick somebody out. That's a national team player that also played in a quarterfinal team in the World Cup. That's the kind of belief that you need to have, and I have that belief in you. You need to have that belief in yourself.
Yeah, and I think there's something. I mean, there aren't that many American players who are playing in the Champions League, and that is. I think I don't know that there's a lot of argument that what you see in the Champions League is the best soccer that exists on the planet. I mean, it's the
Yes.
it's the best team play. You're going up against the best organized, best drilled, best coached, most talented teams. If you can do well against those defenses or against those attackers or in goal against those teams, you have literally nothing left to prove. And it is a shame that there are very few Americans who are getting that opportunity. Altidore at Sunderland, it's going to be a minor miracle. I mean, Sunderland's been looking a little bit better lately, but they're still do very well to not end up in the championship. They've got no shot at winding up in Europe. And I think maybe this is me just reading into it a little bit, but there is a big payday in the Premier League and there's a big payday in MLS, but outside of a few teams in the Premier League, there's not a lot of great passing, really defensively, tactically savvy teams in the Premier League for somebody to slot into. I mean, you've got a couple teams that are really good, but there's not spaces for Americans in those, and I wonder if Roma, I really liked the way Roma played. I mean, it's not always the most exciting game, but it's really tactically savvy. It's a very smart pressing game, really good counterattacking game, and I wonder if teams like that are not as high profile in the international landscape as teams that you see in the Premier League. But I wonder if teams like that is maybe more what Klinsmann wants to see people do. I mean, there are a lot of very good soccer playing sides in Europe that aren't huge names, but that play incredibly well. And I think that being on teams like that is going to do more for somebody's development as a player than they can find anywhere else, even being at a club or in a league that's a little higher profile. And I take his point, and I think it's a really interesting thing to think about when you're weighing like being on television and getting a lot of money and growing your craft and building yourself as a player, which I'm an abject player, so I have no deep knowledge of what that looks like, but you would imagine that spending time on a really savvy footballing side, like you see in kind of the middle tier in Spain, and like you see in Italy, and like you see to a large degree in the Bundesliga and in some of the French teams, not so much anymore. But you've got to think that if you're a 24, 23-year-old player who really wants to test himself and see how you can grow, that's got to be the place that you've got to be looking.
Well, and Michael Bradley, he's 26, and he left Roma for a variety of reasons. One of them being that they had brought in a couple of people in the central midfield to compete with him, and
Hmm.
maybe suddenly he wasn't going to get playing time. And also, Toronto was offering him $5 million more.
Yeah.
Um, I, I
And
think
nobody's gonna, and I don't blame him for doing that at all. I mean, I don't
absolutely,
think there's anything wrong with that.
but I think that's who Klinsmann is looking at. He's saying, you can push past those guys. They might be bringing those guys in for competition, but you can beat them. And if Roma keeps doing what they're doing this year, you might end up in Champions League next year.
Mhm.
But that didn't happen, and now Michael Bradley's back in America. And by the way, he's making about 6 times what he was in Italy, which that was the biggest, like the second biggest surprise to me with the Toronto Bradley thing was that he was only making $1 million at Roma. That was kind of weird to me, and only proved to me the whole undervaluing Americans thing in Europe. I mean, I feel like Bradley was worth a lot more than that.
It should
So
also be noted, though, at the same time, if you look at the state that Toronto FC was in at the end of the 2013 season, you're going to have to offer a lot of money to get a player of that caliber of Michael Bradley's to come over. I mean, you're not
And
going to be,
also,
he's not going to
yeah,
come over for $1.5 million if he's getting paid $1 million.
and
He's got to.
and teams in Italy are not crazy flush. I mean, they're not
Mhm.
throwing around the kind of money that you see, PSG, Man City, teams in the, top of the little league in La Liga or in the EPL. Like those teams don't have that kind of money to be just giving everybody $100,000 a week. So it's made. I mean, it is. Yes, he was not. He was being undervalued, but also, I don't think it's like he was making a quarter of what somebody alongside him was making.
Yeah.
I don't know because they don't publish any of that stuff. But
I think that's fair.
Anything else to say on the national team?
Yeah, just from my perspective as a Canadian, I think it's a psychological thing you guys are talking about, and psychological things are super important. Don't get me wrong, but I think at the same time, the discussion is it's people are overselling it almost. I don't want to say they're overselling it, but it's being blown out of proportion. That's what I'm looking for. I think it's definitely worth noting, and have discussion to make sure that your players have confidence, they have a good psychological state when they're hitting the field. But at the same time, you don't have to overthink it, because overthinking it can lead to the opposite thing of having great self-belief. So I think the conversation just needs to be short and good around it, but don't overthink it, guys. We want to see you do well too.
I also think that it's just a strong and kind of current theme in American sports media. There's been so much talk about the Seahawks and the attitude and Pete Carroll and what he brought to that team and how much that contributed. Not to undersell those guys or their talent. Obviously, they're a very talented team, and I'm not sure how much of that translates to MLS, but I think that it's just a theme that the sports media is really harping on in America right now. And since we're talking about the American team, we've got this example so recently that I agree. I think that it might be a bigger story than we're making it. The issue is that every World Cup team has players that are playing at the club level. They're not a club team. They don't practice year in and year out in the same facilities and build that chemistry. But every country in the world has to deal with that challenge. So why is it different for us to have to feel that way?
Yeah, that's the way I feel. Don't ignore it, but consider it, but don't overthink it at the same time. I think that's a fair way to put it. I think what you're saying is right. Is the chemistry, getting the chemistry together is very important, because you do have a lot of players who are outside of different teams playing together, but just a matter of getting it together. And yeah, like I said, we want you guys to do well, because MLS. It's good for MLS
Thanks.
at the end of the day. So.
Oh, I know. That's so sweet.
Then let's keep talking MLS. We've got some more previews to do of teams for our upcoming season.
Hey, speaking of a team with maybe not the most amazing talent, but a very well-coached team, I've got my Portland preview, which I'm going to try to keep short. So is everybody nestled in? You ready for this?
Got my hot cocoa.
Yeah, good. No, so I mean, obviously last year was a really good year for Portland. It was a good building year, because honestly, the team and the facilities, the facilities were largely ready, but the coaching staff and a lot of stuff around the team in 2011 and 2012 were so poorly constructed that really last year was like a building year rather than a rebuilding year. But it was a very successful building year, and there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm around the club, a lot of extremely high expectations that people have because they finished first in the West. And looking forward to this year, they do have a stronger team than they had last year, without a doubt. But for a couple reasons that I'm going to go into, I don't think that they're going to do that much better than they did last year. They may even do worse. And I think that 54 points is not going to be top of the West come, end of October, beginning of November this year. I do expect them to do kind of around the same thing that they did last year. I mean, in terms of, probably not losing a lot of games, probably drawing a fair number of games. But to look at last year really quickly, Portland had a couple catastrophic injuries in their back line. So they started out with this guy, Mikel Silvestre, who's an older EPL pro, and a guy, David Horst, who was a younger but very talented player. And both of them went down with season-ending injuries pretty early on. So the whole plan of building out of the back and being this really ball-controlling, possession-oriented team kind of fell apart pretty quickly. So what we wound up with was Portland either drawing games somewhat fortuitously. I mean, so that saw them get pretty far and saw them do pretty well.
I think we lost you there for a second.
We lost you. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
For about 5 seconds.
Yeah. So instead of building, from the back and a possession team.
Yeah. Are we going to be able to edit this together?
Yeah.
Okay.
That'll be fine.
Instead of building from the back, they wound up playing a lot more counterattacking football and grinding out a lot of close draws or really close wins. And Donovan Ricketts was keeper of the year last year. He's going to be a year older, but he really held, without him making a lot of remarkable saves, 3 points could have been 1 point, and 1 point could have been 0 points. 3 points could have been 0 points as well. He really bailed the team out. He's going to be a year older going into this, and I think that Portland's luck that they had last year is not going to carry through to the season coming. The good news is they're a much stronger team. So they brought in a new Argentinian center back whose name is Norberto Paparetto, which I think is just a great name. And he's a very, very good passer. He's strong. He's about 6'4". He's very comfortable in the slide tackle. He's a very good passer. They also paired him up with a guy, Pamadou Ka, who is, I think, unanimously the least likable player on the Timbers. He's the one who is most likely to kick someone in the head and just generally act like a complete lunatic. But I think they'll be a lot stronger at the back, and I think the core of the team that was there in the center with Diego Valeri, Will Johnson, Diego Chara, that's all going to be the same. We've brought in a new attacker, a guy named Gaston Fernandez, who's an Argentinian, and we've brought in the middle of last year, and I think the most bizarre trade last year, an impact designated player named Max Arudi from Toronto. And Dennis, do you have any idea why they brought him in and then bailed on him right away?
I don't know. There's something inside stuff going on there that I don't think I have an answer for you. But he didn't even play a half, so.
Yeah, he is a good player.
He's great, right?
He's an upgrade over Ryan Johnson. But
which you also got from us.
Which we also got from you guys. But they're the same. They're the same kind of players.
Yeah.
So. The same weaknesses that Portland had last year, where if you can park a good defensive midfielder at the front of the box and really stop them, like we saw Salt Lake do when they got stomped in the playoffs, that's still going to work again. And I think they're going to be less reliant on long balls into the box, but they're still going to be reliant on trying to play right through the center, because we still aren't going to have any really solid wingers. So I was listening to the Soccer by Ives podcast, and he said that Portland is his pick for the MLS Cup this year. I would bet many valuable objects that that's not going to happen. I think that they will have a good season, but I think the same weaknesses are there with that team. They're gonna play very well. They're going to play some very pretty soccer, and I'd be really shocked if they don't make the playoffs. But I also don't see them being first, and I certainly don't see them lifting the cup because LA is going to be as good or better. Seattle is going to be a better team unit. At least they've looked like that in their preseason games. Salt Lake is not going to get that much worse. They may be a little disorganized without Jason Kreis there, but I don't think it's going to be anywhere near the cakewalk that a lot of Timbers fans seem to be imagining that it is. So my prediction, second or third.
Okay, and I want to ask two questions of you. Number one, have you had a chance to see Gaston Fernandez in the preseason games?
Yes, and he is very, very nimble with the ball at his feet. He is a pickup of a player, not as a designated player.
He looks to me like he belongs on the Timbers. Watching him play, he just fit the style. I mean, despite the small stature, it's obviously not his forte, but it looked like he was exactly who you should have picked up. I was impressed and scared.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about it's one of the things that we really like about Caleb Porter, and I can speak for lots of people on this, is that, it feels like there's a project going on. So when you lose a game or when a guy comes in and it doesn't work out or you get an injury, and, we had a stretch where we lost a bunch of games in the middle of last year, and we all thought, well, this is part of this project that this guy's doing, and there's enough trust in him that he is doing something. And you can see it with the players that he brings in. Like, Fernandez looked comfortable right away. Paparetto looked comfortable right away. Silo Shuma, who was a kind of miraculous pickup in the draft, was rated to go a lot higher and didn't go higher, but he looked very comfortable right away. Porter's picking players for his system, not picking his system based on his players, and it feels good to watch, And that will get him a lot of credit, even if he does have a bad season this season.
Okay, so final question for you then is, you say you don't see lifting the cup. What about Supporters Shield chances? Do you see a deep Open Cup run? What's your worst case, best case that don't involve MLS Cup?
Supporters Shield, I don't think that they have the depth to do that, especially because they're going to be competing in the CONCACAF Champions League as well. So that's more games and a lot more travel. Open Cup, you never know. Honestly, MLS playoffs, you never know either, but I don't see them sneaking past Salt Lake, if they have to play them. Another thing I should mention in the Supporters Shield is that Portland's schedule this year is very, very difficult. They play at Salt Lake twice. They play at Colorado twice, which is tough to play at altitude. A bunch of teams that were very good that came to visit last year, Toronto, New York, they're going to play at this year. So it's a very hard schedule. Somebody was putting together the numbers and figured that it was one of the 3 hardest schedules anybody could have. So I think that means that a Supporters Shield is not particularly likely for them either. Open Cup, you never know.
Now, when I look at Portland, there was a thread recently on RMLS about historical moments, and at one point I tried to get into an argument with Matt Doyle about who early 90s DC reminded me of, and what I said was the early 90s DC reminded me most modern team was last year's Portland Timbers, and I think this year's Portland Timbers might even prove me more correct. Y'all have got your bunch of South Americans in Diego Valeri. Valeri's like your Echeverry, and maybe Urruti will be like your Jaime Moreno, and now you've got Gaston Fernandez. And you've got a bunch of really solid players, none of whom are really standout stars, but a lot of them who could or should be playing on their national teams, like